I guess I got a little story for you here. Last video left Lakeview, flew on back down here to Benton, tucked the airplane away. That was the last time it started. And the reason is, oh, I haven't got to the bottom of the reason yet. But basically what would happen is a crank, and then I get like a gear grinding noise in the starter assembly area, which is in the back of the engine. So I'll kind of explain this a little more in this video. Alright, so this is my third engine that I picked up with a gearbox. I'm going to rob the parts off of this one to see if it fixes the one on the airplane. And what I'm suspecting is the problem is the starter clutch, which is inside the magneto case. So I'm going to pull that and show you what I'm talking about. There's going to be a magneto flywheel in there. I'm going to have to pull that to get to the starter gear and the starter clutch. The way the starter works is it goes in, there's not a Bendix like you'd see on a normal airplane. The gear is always in contact with a idler gear and then the main gear, and once it gets started there's a clutch that's free spinning when it's running. Kind of a, I don't know, not an ideal situation, but this is also where the stator is, and on top is, right up here is the crank sensor. So that's where we're getting the error, is the crank sensor is not syncing, and it has to do with when it's cranking, I think that clutch is slipping. So that's what I'm trying to diagnose. Instead of buying a new clutch, I'm just going to rob one off of this engine because I'm not using it right now, and if it fixes the problem then I'll put a new clutch on this one. Because while I'm starting I'm getting a grind noise. Now, there's nothing wrong with any of the gears, so the only thing I can figure is that clutch is slipping. And when it slips, there's a change in speed of the magneto cover, which causes the cam sensor to disagree. So I got to pull that. You need a puller on there. I already got the bolt that's torqued on at 94 foot-pounds off, which is good. I got the case, the magneto cover off. I don't have a lot of room to work, but my puller, the bolt to pull that off is too long. So I cut one down and tried it yesterday, but I stripped it out. So I went and bought another puller, and so now I've got to get this piece off. And so that's what I'm doing now. I've got another one from another engine that's ready to go on. Put it all back together, try it out, and hopefully that's what the issue is. But like always, I said I would share any problems I have with this engine with you guys. It was a great trip to Idaho. Everything went really well. It started doing this about 2 days or 3 days before I came home, and actually that last start in Lakeview I was really not sure it was going to start, and that was the last time it started. So kind of got lucky that way. I made it home, but I'm pretty kind of disappointed in the fact that this is how difficult it is to fix this problem, and if this happened in the field, I don't really know what I'd do. If it was like in the backcountry somewhere, it could really be a problem. So I'll keep you updated on this issue. Alright, so my puller worked. So what I did with the puller was I just cut this little, the puller push bolt down so that it would fit between the firewall and the magneto housing. That did work, so it pulled it off, so you can see it's no longer on there. So here's your magneto, basically your flywheel. Full of magnets, the stator sits inside of that. That's what creates your electricity. It does have a woodruff key, and we suspected that might be broken. It is not, looks fine. This is the sprag clutch or one-way clutch that then rides on the starter gear, sets into that. So here's two starter gears, and this is the one that came out. So it sits into that gear and spins one way but not the other. So And looking at this, hopefully you guys can see, that race is all scored up. Alright, so I want to show you guys what was going on with the start. So you can see right where my finger is here. This one drive dog in this sprag clutch has some little marks on it. Let's see if I zoom in on it there. So that's the one bad part of this clutch. And so that uneven surface there was what was causing the damage to the race on the starter gear. I can get it zoomed in here so you can see kind of those grooves in there. When I was starting, it would slip and then chatter on there, and that's what that grinding noise was. So, long story short, starter gear needs to be replaced, and the clutch, the starter clutch needs to be replaced. And I believe this wore out because of the hard starting I've had over the last half a year, and just crank to get it to start. And we'll get into why it wasn't starting, because we did mostly figure that out. But I did take the starter gear and the clutch off of my spare motor, which is right here, and put it on the motor in the airplane. So I need to get new parts to go back onto this engine so that it's good to go if I ever need it. And then I'll get into a little bit about what was going on with the crank sensor. Alright guys, so basically this sits in there about like that. That magneto flywheel goes over the top of the stator. Then this little sensor up here is the crank sensor. So that's what was not syncing with the cam sensor. So this sensor looks at these teeth on this flywheel as they come by, and there is 8 of them. So we're going to replace that clutch, and then the other sensor that it kind of talks to is your cam sensor. So this is your cam sensor up here on top of the valve cover. Looks down at the cam. So the cam and crank sensor have to align in order for it to throw spark. And so when I crank it, it wouldn't fire off because they weren't aligning, probably because that clutch was slipping. And then every once in a while it would get that grind noise where it would really slip and they would line up and it would fire off. So it was taking quite a bit of cranking to get it to start towards the end of that trip. So I think basically what had happened is that starter clutch has gone out. So to prove that theory, I'm going to go ahead and put it back together with the new parts and we'll test it. All right guys, welcome back to the Kitfox Garage. Today's video is sponsored by Varla scooters. This is the Eagle One, and let me tell you what, this is a whole new level of scooters over the ones I've reviewed in the past. Those get the job done until you hit a hill, and then they didn't have enough power. So this one is just got amazing power. It's a dual motor, so the rear wheel has a motor that's larger than the motors on the other scooters, and it has that same motor in the front as well. So a 1,000 watt motor in the back, 1,000 in the front for a combination of 2,000 watts of motor power. Battery is huge. It's 54 volt, 18.2 amp hours, and it is got tons of power and range. So this thing can do 40 miles on a charge if you're running it in eco mode with just one of the motors running, which gets you a consistent 20 miles per hour, no problem, just like the other scooters, but it's got better range. If you come to a hill and you want to really power up that hill, or you want to go faster in the flats, you can kick it into dual motor mode and then take it out of eco mode into turbo mode, and this thing will do 40 miles an hour. I have yet to be able to hold the throttle in long enough to get to 40 because I chicken out right around, I think I've had it to 36. And 36 on a scooter feels like you're doing about 110. So this thing just rips. Matter of fact, if you're in the dual motor mode and you hit that turbo switch, when you hit the throttle, it'll actually spin that front wheel. And I'll show you that in some of the ride video. But this thing's great. It has tons of power, great range. It's got a key on it, so you can take it into town and leave it parked out somewhere without worrying about someone riding off on it. And they could pick it up and throw it in their car, but without the key, it's not going to do them any good. And picking it up is a bit of an effort, and that's really the only drawback I've seen on this scooter is it does weigh 77 pounds versus the other ones, 2 of them together weigh about that. So it is heavier. The dimensions are slightly longer, but it does fold up. This whole top part folds down. So it should fit in the airplane, no problem. I haven't had it in there yet, but it should fit in there. And I have the capacity at 77 pounds. We can go to 150 pounds in the baggage on a Kitfox. So it's definitely a scooter that's going to work for flying and pulling out and having decent transportation with good range when you get to your destination. Like I said, this thing really rips. It's got front and rear suspension also. So you're not limited to the small tires with stiff, no suspension like those other scooters. You can take this off-road. So really this is about, you know, as close to the capability of a one-wheel you're going to get with a two-wheel scooter. Saying it's faster, it's got better range than a one-wheel, and I think at the higher speeds, I think it's a safer option, especially for some of the older guys, me included in that, that have been known to take a bit of a spill on those one-wheels when we get going too fast. So this is a great option. You guys go ahead and check it out. There'll be information in the link below. And let me roll some footage of this thing in action. Alright, so I've replaced the parts on the engine that's in the airplane with the parts off of my spare engine here. But I don't want to leave this engine in pieces, basically. So I need to go ahead and replace the parts that are on here. So I ordered up a new ring gear with a good race, or starter gear, and a new sprag clutch and magneto housing flywheel. So I'll go ahead and put those back on, and then before I put the stator cover back on, I'll show you how all that works real good, so you get an idea of what was going on. Alright, so here we are with the starter gear, the idler gear, which has a sprocket on the backside that engages the starter ring gear. So when the starter kicks over, it's going to spin this guy one way or the other. And then the sprag clutch is in the magneto, and that's going to go on here. I'll show you how all that goes together. Okay, so that's it. So this is the magneto flywheel with the teeth on it. This is where the sensor reads the crank speed, or crank sensor reads these teeth. There's 8 of them. And that's bolted on with the starter gear behind it with a sprag clutch. So when you engage the starter, these 3 gears all spin, cranking over the motor. And then once it starts, they stop, and this is allowed to continue to spin while these gears are stationary. So in its running phase, when the engine's running from idle all the way up to 11,000 RPMs, these are all stationary right here. And this thing's spinning on that sprag clutch. Okay, so the stator is back on. Stator cover is torqued on, new gasket. So we've got a new magneto, starter gear, starter clutch, all in place here on this spare engine. So it's good to go if it needs to be dropped in for any reason. Even has a gearbox on it. This engine's good to go. Alright, so we got it back together. I'll go ahead and give it a start and see how it does here. One of the things we do is on the AM display, I can show whether I'm syncing the crank or not by going to page 3, and it'll be right here. It says not synced right now. Okay. So here's a video update of where we're at. So I did change out the mag, flywheel, the gear, new gaskets. I also went ahead and replaced the stator, which has the crank sensor in it. I put all of that on, so the engine basically has all new components for a starter. It's got a new starter ring gear, new basically it's a flywheel, stator, crank sensor. And it was still, when I crank it, the noise that was coming out of the starting area is gone. So that we fixed that problem by replacing that clutch. But then it still wouldn't start. So kind of was scratching my head about it. So we've been diving into all kinds of stuff and tried changing out the cam sensor, all kinds of stuff. Even tried a different ECU. We've been data logging the starts, working with Brian Dacus to figure it out. And what it came down to was, this is your plug for your crank sensor. We reversed these two wires. So we reversed the polarity on the crank sensor and it started right up. So that was the issue. It is something that's mentioned in Brian's troubleshooting guide on the installation of the AEM setup. But apparently the cam or crank sensor is very sensitive about which wire is which. There's a slide of the installation instructions from Brian Dacus's AEM system. And you can see from the troubleshooting that if it doesn't produce the spark, you go ahead and swap these wires like we've done. The question we still have though is why it ran with the wires swapped the other way. Obviously it didn't start very well, and it ran once it started, but we went back and looked through some of the engine logs that we've done since we put this engine in, and it showed lots of cam and crank sensor errors. And so after doing this switch, I went ahead and logged some flights and found 0 errors. So there's definitely something there as far as having those wires switched that was causing those errors. Why it ran that way, we can't answer that. It did run with them swapped, but it did throw errors. So now that the wire's in the proper position, the engine's running just fine. All right, I was able to dig up some files, and as I start scrolling to the right here, you can see the valleys and the crests of the green line, and then the red flashing over on the left from 100 to 0. That's as the sync syncs up, it turns green, and then when it unsyncs, it turns red. So that's the cam and crank sensors not agreeing here. And go back and look under the sync error, there's 18 of them here, and also some crank errors. So here's a flight that I did where it started fine. This was back about a year ago. I just pulled this one because after the flight I went back and looked at it, and look at the crank timing errors. They're in the hundreds of thousands. So something was going on there. Even though the engine was running fine, we're getting those errors. So this one here is after I made all the repairs. You can see it syncs up, starts just fine, and there's no errors. You can see at all during the start process. And even the sync state, there was just one sync state, so it didn't sync and unsync. And then as we slide through all the way, this was about, 40 minutes into the flight, you can see there are no crank timing errors, no syncing errors at all. But anyway, fire's right up now, so we put it all back together, go flying again. So really it turned out to be as simple as 2 wires, but the fact that it took so long to start is what wore out that starter clutch. So now that it fires right off, I don't have really any concerns about that starter clutch going out again. So that should be all set, and it does start right up now. Crank the key, pops right over, good to go. All right, I've been waiting around all day for this to arrive. Just took the crate apart. So these are our 2 freshly overhauled engines from Casey Hawk at Hawk Performance. Took about a month and a half if you include the shipping time. The yellow one is my engine, and the silver one is my buddy Tim's. Actually, originally were both my engines. I sold this one to Tim, and then he had it overhauled. Basically put back stock. Mine we did quite a bit of work to. So basically the same internals that you would probably see on an Edge APEX are done to this engine. So it's got 10-to-1 pistons, Carrillo rods, new head studs. He does an oil pump mod that basically increases your oil pressure. All kinds of work done here. I'll get the spec sheet out on it and everything. And then he did the vapor honing, or whatever they do, the blast and clean the engine. And then he powder coated all accessory pieces, like the top and bottom and the front, rear cover. And anyway, that's all done with powder coated in yellow. He did the same thing on Tim's engine to the exterior. He just used a silver powder for the powder coating. But that looks real nice also. Real clean engine, both of them. So these are basically as close to zero-time new engines as you can get on the APEX. Looks like they traveled well in our crate. And this is going to be my turbo motor. So that's this winter's project, is to work out a header, intake box, intercooler, and turbo system. So that engine's all set up for boost, and it should be capable of 300 horsepower with what we've done to it internally. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the like and notification bell. Go ahead and check out the Varla scooters. I really appreciate it. I want to thank Varla for sending us out this scooter to try out, and stay tuned for the next one.